pretend
Okay.
that Dorothy did not say
Gonna start
that.
recording. All right. Most of you know Nico, but I'll introduce him anyways. Dr. Carlos Nicolas, Gomez Marchant. Thanks for being here. We're excited about having you. I'm especially excited. I don't have any other introductory remarks. Pass it on. Yeah. I know.
It's okay. I remember every time I introduced somebody, it always went really, really bad. So I'll be best. Always slightly insulted somebody.
Hopefully it didn't insult me.
Okay, so I guess I just realized how much of an ego I have, so I'm gonna take off my mask to present. So I want to start by thanking MESA and the colloquium organizers for inviting me to speak today. The title of my talk is No estoy roto, hice un molde, embracing my Latinidad within the whiteness of mathematics education. And in this talk, I'm going to be focused on two constructs of research I do that are foundational to my testimony and to the work that I do. The first is storytelling, specifically counter storytelling, a tenet of critical race theory. And the second is borderlands, influenced by the work of Gloria Anzaldúa. But first, I need to make 2 points. The first is that throughout this presentation, you'll see the usage of art, poetry, and music. My intention here is to challenge spaces where we find valuable knowledge. I investigate the experiences of Latino learners and Latinx learners, but I can and have learned a lot about Latinx experiences through the mediums beyond the academic journal. I want to value these other ways of constructing and disseminating valuable knowledge. And I do this in my methods courses too. I use a variety of mediums to discuss our role as mathematics teachers. I use podcasts, music, art, poetry, and that usage is pretty common in the course. And these mediums are also available to the students to use as well to demonstrate their valuable knowledge. The second point I want to make, which for some reason didn't copy it, is yeah. So the second point I want to make is about the terminology that I use in regards to the ways that I discuss Latinx learners. Normally, I use the phrase raza instead. And I use this for a couple of reasons. A, the terms Latinx and Latino and even Hispanic were not from the community. They were assigned to label the group. And we see that as a form to continue colonization and continue forms of oppression and control and dominance. So I try not to use that discourse. I also use raza instead to honor the perseverance and resistance of the community and use it as a political act to give a nod to the Chicano movement and to the many civil rights and social justice leaders in the community that empowered that phrase during that time through political statements like Viva la Raza, etc. And even the political party that formed for a second of La Raza Unida. And so I use that instead of the other kind of constructive forms. So stories help us in organizing narratives in such a way to construct our reality. The stories passed down to us are gifts to connect our present to the past and provide our links to the future. Storytelling as an oral tradition was a way to share experiences and pass on lessons about hope, resistance, oppression, and pain. And I'm going to share one such example. The following is the first stanzas of the poem I Am Joaquin by Rodolfo Corqui Gonzalez. I am Joaquin, lost in a world of confusion, caught up in the whirl of a gringo society, confused by the rules, scorned by attitudes, suppressed by manipulations, and destroyed by modern society. My fathers have lost the economic battle and won the struggle of cultural survival. And now I must choose between the paradox of victory of the spirit, despite physical hunger, or to exist in the grasp of American social neurosis, sterilization of the soul, and a full stomach. So storytelling is a healing act. It is how we teach others to resist. It is how we help others see things that they could not see before. I use storytelling to create a space where we can challenge norms to construct new realities. My testimonial is a counter story. And as a counter story, my goal is to emphasize the endemic nature of racism, to challenge the majoritarian or dominant stories, to demonstrate the value of the experiential knowledge of people of color, and to work towards commitment to social justice. Moreover, counter stories help in building community by stressing the humanity in the educational research that is usually erased. Gloria Zaldua's book, Borderlands, changed my life, and I'll tell that story later. I'm going to focus more on the metaphoric and literal borderlands. Borders are man-made. They are constructed to define property and to define ownership of land. As Anzaldúa writes, borders are set up to define the places that are safe and unsafe, to distinguish us from them. A border is a dividing line, a narrow strip along a steep edge. A borderland is a vague and undetermined place created by the emotional residue of an unnatural boundary. It is a constant state of transition. She continues and discusses borderlands with a capital B as being the emotional state of in-betweenness, or napatla. We heard earlier a description of this kind of emotional state in the poem I Am Joaquin, when he realizes he has a choice to make, try to preserve his culture or assimilate. But Anzaldúa argues we are both and, a hybrid of two or more cultures. And because of this hybridity, as Napantleteras and Napantleteros, we are in a position to create new and powerful knowledge, if we are willing to live in Napantla, in the tension of being in between. And according to Anzaldúa, this begins with an arrebato, a trauma that reminds us that we are not one or the other, an event forcing us back into the borderlands in the state of Napantla. We either work towards the path of conocimiento, a recognition of our in-betweenness, of our otherness, an attempt to reverse the colonization that has been passed on through cultural practices and the construction of myths that operate in everyday discourse, or a path of desconocimiento, where we assimilate to the dominant culture. Being on one of these paths is not permanent, and they are fleeting. Another arrebato is going to happen. So staying on the path of conocimiento is accomplished through the continuous attempts to heal from these arrebatos. So I have two goals in sharing, in giving you my testimonial, my counter story, in attempting to arm myself with retrospect. The first, as with all storytelling, is to heal, to put myself back on that path of conocimiento. And there are some arrebatos that are simply wounds that will never heal, but we can tend to them, remind ourselves of how they happened, and not be afraid to tell the story, so that hopefully it won't happen to others, and possibly build a community who also share the similar wounds. And we can strengthen traditions of social, political, and cultural survival and resistance. The other is to move us beyond the acknowledgement of racism to actions that resist and disrupt systems of power, perpetuating white supremacy. So I'm going to frame this story in 2 acts and a prelude. The prelude is for me to provide more background and my role as a storyteller. I need to contextualize my point of view and the generational trauma that has informed it. Thereafter, the first act will focus on the 2 times that I've changed my name. Not really my name, but more like what I go by. But I have found that this act to be quite political and fundamental to my vision of myself in the academy. The last act will focus on the Mi Raza, Mi Lengua, Mis Matemáticas collective, or the Mi Tres collective. And this is the space where I'm currently putting into action my acknowledgement of racism and the whiteness of our institutions and organizations. And it is the space where I'm trying to do things differently. Prelude. So I was born in Santiago, Chile on February 12, 1985, 12 years into General Augusto Pinochet's dictatorship. On September 11, 1973, President Salvador Allende's socialist government was overthrown by a military coup with the help of the US, instating a military dictatorship that lasted from 1973 to 1990. And during this time, Pinochet's government was directly responsible for the killing of at least 3,197 people and the torture of about 29,000. My father was one of those tortured. I don't know exactly why it happened. My parents have not talked much about that time period in their lives. And I don't wish to have them relive that trauma. But it was after being tortured that they decided they had to leave all their loved ones, everything they had, and come to the US. And they did that in December of 1989. But this is me telling their story. And this is recounting what I've heard. And this is, the question always comes up, is this the best way to center their experiences, their stories? And this is one of the borderlands that I work through as a researcher. What are the tensions of me using my voice to tell a story of the participants, of the people I'm working with, versus trying to amplify theirs? How do I balance that? And there's always going to be a tension as a researcher about how to do that. So this pushed me to finally have the courage to talk to my parents about that moment of arriving in the US and what that experience was like. And I did this because I asked prospective teachers I work with to conduct oral history interviews as an assignment in their methods course. My goal with the assignment is to push the prospective teachers to see the valuable experiential knowledge of their own family members and communities. In addition, it highlights the community cultural wealth that is available to them that they may not have realized. And it also gives them insight on others' experiences learning mathematics and navigating school systems. And sometimes we just need an excuse to pause, to sit down and listen to the stories of the members from the community. So I'm stepping aside to provide them a space to share their own experiences, for their voices to be heard. So here I asked them about the first year in the US and some of the challenges they faced. Last. Okay, it was here.
Maybe try start watching, but the button right
there. No, respecto de las primeras luchas que tuvimos que dar, lo que realmente fue muy difícil era sentir seguridad en sí mismo. ¿Por qué razón? Porque en primer lugar, el trabajo. Tenías que garantizarlo, tenías que asegurarlo. Habían 4 hombres que estaban 100% dependiendo de ese trabajo mío. Y no solo eso, sino su crecimiento y todo. Entonces, y era un trabajo muy desafiante, la NAFTA, el North America Future Agreement. Muy desafiante, con muchas, también compartiendo con 2 países, con México y Estados Unidos, lo que lo hacía más difícil porque no conocía ninguna de las 2 culturas y tenía que intercambiar, digamos, opiniones y formas de trabajo entre los 2.
Pero también el año más difícil fue, el primer año fue adaptarnos, empezar a buscar amigos, adaptarnos a la educación de los niños, adaptarnos a un sistema que es totalmente diferente al que nosotros traíamos, buscar amiguitos para ello, y lamentablemente yo no hablo el inglés, y el español que yo hablo es totalmente diferente, entonces yo a veces trataba de de compartir con alguna mamá que yo la escuchaba que hablaba en español y ellos no entendían diferente. Entonces, sí fue el primer año, un año de alegrías, pero también de penas y de sentirse solo, totalmente solo, porque la primera Navidad, en los primeros cumpleaños sin familia, eso es duro, duro.
Oye, respecto a lo que mencionabas de la educación, era un problema grave. Un problema grave porque, por un lado, tú quieres que tus hijos conserven la cultura de sus raíces. Pero por otro lado, tú necesitas apoyarlo para que se incorpore a la cultura americana o Tex-Mex en este caso. Entonces, teníamos que ser lo suficientemente balanceados como para que, por un lado, por ejemplo, conservaran, bueno, apenas hablaban español, sobre todo el caso del más pequeño, pero conservaran lo que sabían de su idioma y al mismo tiempo valoraran los principios y los valores de familia, digamos, que se inculcan tanto en nuestro país.
So my parents described here a borderland. There is a tension of trying to preserve one's culture while at the same time recognizing some assimilation will be necessary for their survival. They acknowledge their in-betweenness in the state of Napantna and the need to find a way where they can be both and. So I grew up in this borderland. I grew up in El Paso, Texas, a city on the US-Mexico border, crossing back and forth both the literal border to Ciudad Juarez and the metaphorical ones that my parents lived and tracked. But I too, as I went through the American education system, found I had my own borderlands to navigate. Act 1, the Americanization of Nick Gomez. Schools are constructed social institutions that perpetuate majoritarian narratives that enforce the racial hierarchies that make up our society. Schools were never built with students of color in mind. Instead, education was seen and still is the strongest tool for assimilation and erasure. As Cridlin Hughes and King wrote, through the hidden curriculum, children implicitly learn about race, culture, and gender, which indicate a level of humanity, questioning who can be considered human. And Jose Angel Gutierrez puts it quite straightforward. The American capitalist system was imposed on the Mexican people via white institutions. In the schools, the Mexican children were segregated and denuded of their culture as a prerequisite to learning the Anglo way. The purpose of the educational system is to make Anglo out of all children. Those Chicano children that refuse to conform and resist to this cultural and psychological genocide are pushed out of the school system. And even today, we've seen how anti-critical race theory bills are erasing the history and perspectives of people of color, all for the comfort of white people. But there are other guidelines to control and domination. For La Raza, this has involved controlling and limiting language. And mathematics classrooms are not immune to these racist storylines. As Zavala found, students' perspectives of being successful in mathematics was related to racial stereotypes, raza as violent or raza as illegals, because the stereotypes to the students provided explanatory power for the underachievement of raza learners. In terms of controlling language, certain models of dual language programs for elementary schools state explicitly that mathematics should only be taught in English. Constructing a learning environment where mathematics is an English-only action and the linguistic capital of multilingual learners is therefore delegitimized. So shortly after arriving in the US, I started pre-K. It was there that the first tool of whitewashing was implemented. The teachers Americanized my name. My parents had always called me Nico, and at home I went by Nico. But in school, the teachers and my friends and colleagues there called me Nick. And eventually I began to introduce myself as Nick Gomez. And that stayed true until about 2017. The school system was very successful in my assimilation, in creating a separation, a tension between who I was at home and who I was at school. I almost never spoke Spanish at school, and that was purely to be done at home. And mathematics, science, literature, and history were all taught through a white gaze. What I did learn was what happened at home was a product of the country they came from, and not something that I needed in order to be successful. Another borderland. This time the tension between my community cultural wealth and the need to be seen and to be successful. The system worked. I came out of my K-12 education exactly the whitewash product the system was designed to create. And it took me until 2018 to take my name back and start unlearning. In 2016, I started working at Clemson University as an assistant professor, and many of the faculty were supportive. But at the same time, and at that time, they did not have the support systems in place for scholars of color. For the 5 years that I was there, I was the only tenure track Raza scholar in the College of Education, and the only Raza scholar in my department, with only 2 or 3 other scholars of color, depending on the year. And if we zoom out for a minute, looking at the data of full-time faculty at post-secondary institutions from the National Center of Educational Statistics, Raza scholars make up 6% of full-time faculty positions at higher education institutions. This lack of representation is important to recognize. It makes a big difference when entering these predominantly white institutions to be one of so few. I felt a responsibility to be more vocal and advocate for the students of color, not just in our undergraduate program, but in our doctoral program too. And I don't feel that I was that successful. I didn't know how. I barely knew my own identity as a scholar of color. And at the same time, I started to feel not seen as part of La Raza. I continually had to remind folks that Uno de la Raza was here. And at the same time, a project I was working on ended abruptly, and I only blamed myself. Not the system that pushed the teachers out, and not the system that created a space that was not supportive for me. And yet I felt a real sense of relief, and I was happy that it was over. I was happy the project was over. I didn't want to do it anymore. I was completely unhappy. And this was the first moment that I stopped and kind of breathed. It was this moment that helped me realize how much I had internalized dominant narratives about research and the consequences of my assimilation. I felt very distant from myself, and I came to the realization what had been missing from my work was me, my experiences, my community, my capital, my ways of being and knowing the world. It was never tapped into. My Latinidad was not legitimized in these spaces, and I didn't really see how. I didn't see how to make it work. I didn't see it in the others' work. I just didn't know. And I realized how broken I was at that moment, because I had forced my body and spirit into a mold, and at times I was unrecognizable to myself. So I had to find a way to heal. So I returned to Gloria Anzaldua's Borderlands, a book I had picked up before, but for some reason I hadn't connected at the time. And in that identity crisis, I could now see that the arrebatos that I had and the arrebatos that I had not been tending. I could see that I had been on a path of desconocimiento. I realized how much the system had worked in whitewashing me, and I was tired. Something had to change, or else I could not envision myself in the academy any further. I knew I had to center my Latinidad in my work and not just at home. I had to bring my full self. So I wanted a way to bridge those borderlands, remain in that tension of otherness. So I started going by Nico and not Nick. And because I wanted the predominantly white institution to know that La Raza was here, que La Raza vive aquí. And I will bring my full self to this institution and not allow the racism of the academy to take that away from me again. But I still had a lot of unlearning to do. One step at a time though, and really committing myself, to my full self in these white institutional spaces was the first step. So I decided to approach the next project differently.
skipped a lot.
I decided to approach the next project differently. And I met with Stacy R. Jones, a graduate student collaborator who was working with me on the previously mentioned project that ended. And I realized that there was this discourse of individualism that had led me to this point. So as D'Angelo writes, the discourse of individualism is a specific set of ideas, words, symbols, and metaphors, a storyline or narrative that creates, communicates, reproduces, and reinforces the concept that each of us are unique individuals and that our group memberships, such as our race, class, or gender, are not important or relevant to our opportunities. This discourse posits that there are no intrinsic barriers to individual success and that the failure is not a consequence of systematic structure, but of the individual's character. In other words, these ideas of individualism perpetuate white supremacy and the racist structures of our system. And we promote this discourse in the academy with the way the doctoral programs and dissertations are constructed. Even though most of us do our work collectively, we insist that these individualistic narratives about dissertations. So I sat with Stacy, and instead of telling her what the next project was, I only came to the meeting with one question. What do you want to do now? She said she wanted to work with elementary students. I had never worked with elementary students before. And I wanted to work with Rasa populations. I wanted my research to reflect myself. And so together over a couple of hours, we met and we came up with a plan. We collaborated and we started reading everything we could about Rasa students' experiences in schools. We challenged one another and came to a compromise and developed the next study, which was called Elementary Latinx Students' Accounts of Learning Mathematics, or ALMA, the SOL. And this was our collective work that helped us both center our ways of being and knowing, and I started healing. Now let's switch. A couple of years later, I started introducing myself intentionally as Carlos Nicolas Gomez Marchant, but you can call me Nico. Gomez is my father's last name and Marchant is my mother's maiden name. This is my full name and the name on my birth certificate. Yet growing up, we stopped at Gomez, again, Americanization. And Marchant felt like a ghost, something that we knew was there, we all knew it was there, but we never said it, we never discussed it. And I felt a little hypocritical at that point. I wasn't being my full self if I do not bring my full name. So every time I introduce myself, I will say my full name in these academic spaces. And then I will give you permission to call me Nico. By saying my full name and introducing my full self, and even now publishing with my full name, I'm also honoring my parents and both of their histories, and I am honoring all the sacrifices that they made. My name is Carlos Nicolas Gomez Marchant, and that is exactly how I want you to say it, because I am fully here. Act 2, intersections of mathematics, language, and race. When I started at the University of Texas at Austin, it was a powerful change for me. I was accepted into a department that had a large number of faculty of color and that many focused on issues of race and language in ways that I am still absolutely in awe of, and honestly, I still feel like a very small fish there. But it is an incredibly supportive environment, and my colleagues continue to push me to do more to challenge systems of power. And right now, before starting at UT, the National Science Foundation, I feel, took a chance, and I was awarded a career grant for the proposal Mi Raza, Mi Lengua, and Mis Matemáticas, Latinx Students' Counter Stories as Doers of Mathematics. I felt at first like I fell back into the path of conocimiento, of desconocimiento. I had to run a research group. I was facilitating everything. I was making all the decisions about what to study and what questions, as if I learned nothing from the previous project designed in collaboration with Stacy, that informed the career grant, that informed everything that we were doing, even up to that point and through the career grant. And I was thinking about the project in that way, because again, the discourse even around the career grant is individualistic. There can only be one PI, it has to be submitted by an individual. You are the one who are awarded this. This is the work that will define your career. When that's not true. I had the amazing opportunity and the opportunity, of course, to be here at UGA. And that I was given as a grad student, I was given the opportunity to collaborate on Dr. Anne Marie Connors and her career grant. And that defined my career too, and other graduate students' careers. And the experiences that I had at UGA with others defined my career. So this discourse around the career grant is also problematic. Again, it puts the individual on the pedestal when that's not how we should be thinking of things, because our entire experience in these spaces is about the collective. But we talk about it as if it is the individual. So I wanted to change that. And so I'm trying to take the lessons from my experiences and apply them to my collaborations with graduate students on this project. And I wanted to push back on the discourses of individualism to center us as a collective endeavor. And so I wanted to collaborate with them to create a space where we can be our full selves, where each of us can be our full selves, where we can feel comfortable pushing back, interrogating, disrupting the institutions that had whitewashed me originally, and hopefully unlearn together. So I don't call it a research group anymore. We are the Mi Lengua, Mi Raza, Mis Matemáticas Collective, or the Mi Tres Collective. We are focusing on the intersections of race, language, and mathematics. We try to provide a space where the collaborators can play with the data and find their own questions. And we support the work. We all support each other in that work. And I try to do as little talking as possible, which is really hard, and I'm still working on it. It's really hard. But I want all the graduate collaborators to feel they have ownership of the project, that we as a collective will be successful, not just the individual. And so the investigations that we are pursuing were not necessarily the questions that I had. Stacy has been an incredible model and mentor to the others in the collective, and others are starting to rise and become leaders there too, leading their own studies, leading their own questions, and leading their own work. And she really has shown how to lead the group on the questions that she has and what has led to her dissertation. And this has helped 3 other collaborators taking lead on their own questions, and we are all continuing to support them in the ways that we can with the time that we have. And most of these questions were not ones that I had at all. I did never thought of them. I'm not as creative as these amazing collaborators that I have. But we learned so much from each other in these research and academic endeavors, but also in how we navigate academic white spaces. Because that includes supporting each other emotionally. The saying by Gloria Ladson-Billings always comes to my mind because it is way too true. It doesn't matter how much you love the university has no capacity to love you back. So stop expecting it to do something it cannot do. So there's that tension again, that borderland. How do we feel we are doing good work, but also please an institution that will never love you? We are in a system, we're in that system too, but the Mi Tres Collective has taught me that we can create our own space, a space where we can say no. And we will not do it that way. We're going to do things differently, and we will heal. Conclusion, what I talk about when I talk about research. Research is autobiographical. Dr. Thomas Ebert said that in one of the classes I took here. I don't remember which one. And now it's a thing that I say a lot, and something that I think I'm starting to internalize. And I push students to not be afraid to include themselves, to include their testimonials in their work. This is much more than a subjectivity statement. It is a statement of humanity in the work that we do. It is a way to rehumanize our research and rehumanize our participants, rehumanize our collaborators. I can't explain the topography of all the borderlands that make up who I am. There are tensions and arrebatos that I'm still not willing to share or talk about yet. I haven't figured out how to tell those stories. But I hope that my testimonial, my counter story, helps you in reflecting on your own borderlands, on your ways of being and navigating these white spaces. And I hope that gives you insight to take action and disrupt, and gives you the courage to be vulnerable and tell your story. I've tried to share how I've gone from learning about myself to valuing my experiential knowledge and that of my community, and how I have to deconstruct and reconstruct and fragment myself and break myself and put myself back together every time. and to learn to embrace the uncertainties of being. Again and again and again and again. And I think I'm at the point now where I can say that's okay. My testimonial can hopefully help you and your collective explore how things can help, how things can and should be done differently, challenging the discourses of individualism and create new discourses collectively. I didn't write this down, but I have time, so I'm gonna do it. I guess we'll call it a postscript. So one of the things that I do in the courses that I teach, the methods courses, is that I always start every semester with an act of gratitude. And I end the semester with the same act of gratitude. And the reason that I do this is because I want the students, the prospective teachers that I work with, to recognize that they've made it to this moment in time, this moment that we're sharing, because of the sacrifices of others. And normally when I tell prospective teachers to do this, they thank their parents, they thank a teacher that's helped them. But what I've realized is a theme, and something that's really had me thinking in the last couple of days, is that they've always took the time to also thank somebody who took a risk with them, who gave them the opportunity to do something different and didn't say, I don't think that's gonna work. They just said, let's just see what happens. And that usually gave them opportunities to work with children, to try new things, to recognize the brilliance of children, and then decide, I want to be a teacher because I want that brilliance. So I'm going to be a little cheesy, and I'm going to take a time to do a little act of gratitude. And luckily they're here. So genuinely want to thank Anna and Dorothy, because this space that I'm sharing now with you all and this story would never have happened if they were not in my life and helping me guide me through these identity crises and name changes that I've gone through. It just would never have happened. And I don't think I would be in the academy if it wasn't for that. And the fact that I can change my name, I can change who I am, and they never questioned it. It was simply like, okay. And they've made mistakes. They've called me the name and all that. And that's okay. They apologize because they recognize that this is important to me. And if it wasn't for these pillars of strength for me, that crack and those breaks would have never held up. So thank you. And thank you all for sharing this space and allowing me that moment of gratitude.
Thank you so much, Nico. We have plenty of time for Q&A. So if anyone has questions for Nico, open it up. Try to, maybe I'll type them into the chat or something. I'll figure out something for the chat. I'll do something to figure things out. Otherwise, yeah, feel free to ask questions.
Yeah.
I have had conversations with friends that are very open about maybe openly critiquing institutions in terms of race, and they knew I had two separate Twitter accounts, and one was a private one where I would do all my critiques, and then I had one was my professional one, and they said, "Why are you doing this? Like, this is." I mean, I told her I was scared. Like, if I critique these things openly, I'm not going to be able to get an academic job after I finish graduate school. And I remember her saying, any place that won't take you because you're saying something honest about an institution is not where you want to work. But so I guess I wanted to ask you if you felt like you landed at a place that seems to support you, but as far as even in some of these states outwardly, have you experienced resistance, pushback?
I think I did at Clemson. I think there was a lot of that, and I have from, I've critiqued our professional organizations for some of the things that they do as well, vocally and to the leadership to some extent. And I think part of it is just having that realization that I was just tired of pretending. And I came to a point where I decided it's a bigger risk for me, or I guess it's less of a risk for me just to do what I think is right and take the consequences, whatever they may be, which might be not getting tenure, which might be not having a job anymore, which might be going back to school. But the risks were worth it, I felt like, at that point. And I also had to accept that I'm read as white, I'm male, I'm cisgender. I have a lot of privileges, so I have to take those risks. I have a responsibility to take those risks because I can do that and still have that privilege that will allow me to be heard in ways that I know my colleagues, my familia scholars of color can't or don't have the opportunities to yet. But hopefully I can use that privilege that I have to create these spaces where they can start being more comfortable in doing all that. But that's partly that inner work that I've been having to do and recognizing that my red as white makes me experience this space of whiteness very differently than many of my colleagues, and to a point where part of that identity crisis is accepting the title of scholar of color. Like it took me a long time to accept that title because I don't want to be taking something away from others who are really going through these issues, who are really going through these inequities and these oppressive structures. And then here I am, it's like, yeah, I'm a scholar of color. You know, like it took me a long time to do that and to step up in trying to be critical of these leadership positions. But yeah, it's the emotional labor that is attached to that is a lot. It's part of that reckoning that we have to do. I feel like, again, it's that tension of those borderlands between what the system will allow me to do versus what I want to do. And how do I reckon those differences and live in that tension and be okay with that tension? And that is, it's a long road to get to that space. And if you're not there, you also have to be able to say, I am not there yet, and that's okay. Which is a whole other level of acceptance.
Thank you.
Something that I think for me, and I feel like I haven't really like done data collection with like real people, and there's just like something
Only
in there.
fake people. Sorry, she said she hasn't done data collection with real people, and I was a jerk.
It's fine. And I just like feel like there's something inherently weird about being a researcher, like this, you know, the kind of like this anthropologist that like evades the space and takes up the resources of the people and their labor, whether it's cognitive or emotional or whatever. How do you navigate that when working, especially working with children of color? Like, because even as being a scholar of color, it can still be weird because you're like, although I'm trying to do this for you, right? Like, am I really respecting who you are and what I'm taking from you? Like, how do you take but also give back, right? Like, how does that work for you?
Great question. How do I take and also give back? I wish I had good answers for you. I don't know yet. Unfortunately, COVID has kind of slowed down a lot of the work that I do. And because I've transferred institutions, I no longer have the relationships with schools that I had previously. So I don't know yet, because that tension that I mentioned at the beginning as a researcher, like how do I disrupt this idea of participant as this objective thing that just exists outside of us, and I'm here to take and never give back.
Yeah.
Like, how do I make this more of a, so one of the things that we do, which has been a little different, is we try to always thank the participants first in the article, not as a footnote, but as an explicit thanks for gifting us their stories. because we have to treat the data as gifts, as fragile things that we have to take care of, and not use their stories as a way to kind of exploit them, if that makes sense. So we try to think about data differently as, like I said, kind of like as gifts. And that metaphor has a lot of assumptions behind it. And we're trying to figure out, like, what does that mean to treat these fragilely? Because we can break the trust. Like these, in the Alama project, we interviewed 46 elementary students in 3rd, 5th, 4th, and 5th grades about their experiences at these predominantly white schools. I mean, some of them shared beautiful stories that we can't just say like, oh, Rocio said this, and then analyze it as if it's this cold, distant thing, but recognizing again that the fact that the student was extremely vulnerable with us and gave us this story to do some good with. What does that mean though? I feel like it means more than just writing articles, but I don't know what to do with it yet. Like, I don't know what that is yet. And in terms of like future data collecting and what that's going to look like and how we give back to the community and make it this reciprocal thing, I don't know what that looks like yet. Like, that's still something that we're struggling with and we're hoping to continue to explore, but we are, as a collective, dedicated to this idea of more than just taking, but respecting and valuing the gifts that they give us.
Have a lot of questions.
Well, time's up. Thank you, everybody.
One, I want to thank you for the honor that the journey, because you traveled on this journey with me as well. And I think the nice thing about seeing your journey and your courage in stepping in, like you said, it is empowering. It's nice that the journey doesn't have to be as long for the next generation, right? And so getting there by telling the story, by helping us talk about these issues and how we're complicit and the whole, you talked about how you present. But racism was always also about that you have to feel like you can't present.
Exactly.
Right.
Yes.
And so we talked about it. I think another thing that's so powerful in your work and this decolonizing work, I'll call it that from myself.
Very,
is-
very generous of you to call it that.
Well, this idea of intent, that you're not, that you're really critically troubling. What is your intent, right, in telling that story? What's your intent in the work we do? It's more than just to write an article. So while you haven't figured that, but you're at that tension, which is, like you said throughout your whole talk, the whole power of this work is being at that intention. And I wonder about when you said someone took a chance on you, can you flip that to see what chances you're taking on someone, right? When they tell that story, right, it's validating that that story even is a thing. So that might be a way to try to give the voice, but also help it in a way that, I don't know, just waiting to hear more stuff that you come out with. So I don't really have a question. I just wanted to thank you for the talk and as also giving the courage and the knowledge about the space we call the academy. This idea about visual.
Yeah, well, yeah, I really appreciate that. And it reminded me of one of my favorite sayings when it comes to doing this work. And I can't accredit it other to the TV show Afterlife with Ricky Gervais and all that, because that's where I heard it, even though I like to say it without accrediting it because it makes me sound fancy. But at the end of the season, one of the characters says, it's like that quote, you plant seeds for trees that you never enjoy the shade for. And I think that's kind of what we try to do by doing this work, by sharing these stories, by sharing these testimonials, by doing the work that we do, is we are planting seeds for things that I won't get to enjoy. It's too late for me. It's even too late for the students who we interviewed and have gifted us their stories, but they gave us those stories with the hope that things will be a little bit better for the next set of students, the next set of kids, and the next set. because for us, it's too late. It's happened, and this is what happened to me. And so that's what the stories are for, or at least that's what I hope they're for. So I appreciate that. You reminded me of that. I don't know if there's any questions in the chat,
Yeah.
which is. I want to give them voice if they have any.
We have no voice.
Just a thank you
Okay.
from Cameron. You're welcome.
And thank you. I see Amy, Stacy, and Sarah
Mhm.
there from the
From
MESA
the
Collective. So
collective.
I genuinely appreciate them.
And now waving and saying hello.
Showing, stopping by and helping me
Thank-
share the space. They've been very supportive as I've been racking my mind for the last month on like what I was going to do during this time. So they've been incredibly supportive and helpful. And I genuinely appreciate them.
This is a comment, that's a question. You just made a comment about maybe sometimes we don't always see, like, we plant the seed, we don't always see how it grows, right? So I want to tell you how some of your seeds grew. Just so that you know. When I first came to the apartment, I did code you, like, you did the sentence right. And I remember when I saw the Nicolas thing, I was like, who is this, right? And when I was told that you changed it, I said, I get it, because, sometimes we'll have our names mispronounced, misspelled, misnamed, and then you kind of go through that for so many years. And this was the year I was like, no more. And I felt like I was going to probably come off as aggressive by saying, hey, my name is not spelled right here. But I felt like I was representing the university for the first time in a long time. And I'm like, I need this to be correct. So that was the thing where I'm like, okay, yes, I get it. But there's also just taking the time to talk to other scholars, because in some of these institutions, you'll find yourself isolated, and like no one's speaking to you. And I said something to you, you probably won't remember this. And I said, how can you rattle off names and years like that? Like you were sent for literature. And I was like, I'm not gonna make it. I can't do that. And you gave me the honest answer. You said, oh, that comes from when you started to do your research. Like you just gave me an honest answer. You didn't say, yeah, sorry about that. You're gonna have to fix it. That happens. People will talk to you like you're lower, as opposed to being honest and saying, I didn't do that at the beginning. I have to be in my work. And that's how I started to learn names. And so I appreciated that. And the other thing you told me was do all of your research in your required courses. You said any project they give you in your required courses, make it about what you want to do, because then you're slowly working towards the end of your degree. And I did that. And so when it came time to do my perspectives, when it came time to do those things, I had this base of literature because I actively chose to pick only articles that were going to be about my work solely because of what you said. So I guess just thank you for those things.
Oh, I mean, I'm really bad at taking compliments. Sorry. It's one of those things I'm working on. So I'm like, okay. It's be uncomfortable right now. But no, I genuinely appreciate that. Like it's rare where we can hear back how our impact has happened. Like usually you gotta wait till somebody introduces you at this time. But, yeah, somebody.
I'm no longer colloquium chapter. I mean, this is my last time. I'm good.
Just saying.
Anna, it's over to you.
Just saying, I had some higher expectations. I thought I'd do some good work, but apparently not. But,
Just seeing somebody as a person.
yeah, I mean, it was one of those things that kind of shocked me at first in the academy. Like, I felt here, most of the faculty saw us that way. But it is kind of like the most shocking part of when you do go to conferences, especially the larger ones, and you do kind of start seeing that people shutting down each other's works, not really focusing on the assets and the strengths, which always felt very hypocritical because one of the, there's two things that we try to, if you're going to walk away with anything from our perspective teachers in our methods course is value students' thinking and be asset-based. Focus on strengths, focus on the good things, and yet we go to these conferences and it's just like, boom, boom, like I don't understand it. To me, it's the same thing. Like, if we are focused on assets, yeah, I may not agree with some of the methods. I may think like, oh, maybe there's a better way to do that. But if I'm silent, what good am I? What good is that? Like, if I'm not going to help, if I'm not going to have these conversations about it, then are we really a community? Are we really helping each other? And I think this is something that I'm still kind of struggling with as I even go to these larger conferences. How do we do that? How do we promote that? And I think some conferences are better at it than others. I think some are real professional organizations and not just businesses. But yeah, it always strikes me as a little bit hypocritical how we do that. And as we keep doing the research, as we share these stories, and as I've heard of stories and so forth, I mean, this statement of like, as scholars of color, you have to do, like, already women have to do twice as much to be seen on the level as everybody else. Scholars of color have to do twice and 3 times as much depending, right? Like, that is still true in the academy. And so if I have to have 12 articles in order to get tenure, I know I'm really going to need like 15 or 16. But knowing that empowers us, knowing that helps us figure out how, and knowing how to get there, and gives us at least some breadcrumbs to know that I'm on the right path.
I just want to say so many really good things. I think one of the small implicit seeds that you plant is just by centering things like stories, poetry, and art. Makes me incredibly happy. And it also just rehumanizes in various ways what mathematics education research can be.
Just feels so cold without it.
Does.
It feels cold and kind of sterile and
Distant.
lifeless. And I feel like we can add that culture. Like, there's so many, like, as I look through the art for today's presentation, I learned so many cool things. Like, I was like, oh my God, like that Italian photographer with the marionette puppets, amazing. She's amazing. And I was just like, I'd never heard of her before.
The two Fridas.
The two
I
Fridas,
thought
I mean, that's to me classic, but where is this?
Yeah.
I mean, this is subtle, but this is for me. It's not for you, and that's okay for me to have this. But Negro Matapaco is actually a Chilean symbol of resistance.
Mm.
So apparently in the 2010 student uprising, where they were protesting, these stray dogs started joining the protests and would attack the police officers. And one went viral, this black dog that was attacking police officers for protesters and protecting them. And the dog name became Negro Matapaco, which is translates to black cop killer. I mean, we're pretty straightforward. Not the most creative name, but you know, that's the point across. Because Paco is the kind of slang for cops in Chile. And so to me, that's just a really cool way of, again, kind of throwing that hint of resistance and perseverance, and in a way that is for me and gives me that.
Yeah.
You know, and still is a symbol of resistance. And even in the latest 2018 student protests, and even in New York City, where they were evading the rises in transportation prices, this became like a symbol throughout New York City as well. So it's also been taken up in various ways. So again, what's nice about art is that you can throw these messages, little Easter eggs, if you will, to some folk, but also add meaning, such that when I am talking about these borderlands, these divisions, you know, we can throw in things like the two Fridas, which I think is such a powerful image of that kind of duality in trying to also be okay with the two of them, the ways that they kind of support each other with the hand holding, etc. So I think there's just a really powerful way to do that through art that I can't do through talk. And these
Yeah.
modalities, again, help us express the humanity of our research.
I like also how you can bring in, like, and it's like, you can bring in yourself, right? You're an artist, you're a musician, you know, you do that. I'm not, but. But there's that self that you bring to your work, and I'm glad that you have the, Thomas Burke, Researcher's Autobiography, because I've just been citing you every time I say it.
No, I know, I take credit for things that I should.
Well, you said it was somebody that you took a class with, and you never had the name, so it's just hard to say, well, someone, think of the. Yeah, bring yourself to the work, and it enriches us as a field.
Yeah, I have really appreciated, Nico has taught me a whole lot about exactly that, about the importance of bringing yourself and your colleagues to the work. And I will say, research has been a collective endeavor my whole time here, and I wouldn't have it any other way. But Nico has been tremendous as a collaborator, and just has taught me so much.
We were like 10.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, just to respect it, yeah, just to.
Some data.
So plenty of data. Don't give me that shit.
To respect everybody's time, want to thank Nico one more time. And we are going to have, Nico's here until tomorrow. We're going to have a more informal gathering tomorrow afternoon at 1. That's the only one that we have planned. Nico, you may have other things on your schedule. But if anybody would like to come to that, we've nailed down the time, but we haven't nailed down a location. So it will figure that out before we disperse after this. Otherwise,
It will be in this building, or it will be.
that's what we haven't decided, if it was going to be at a coffee shop, if it was going to be here at Adderhold, if it was going to be outside of the picnic table. Could be a variety of places. I'm gonna turn off the Zoom and cut off that though before we continue that. And if anybody needs to go, but you guys can.
Was this
Thank you.
recorded?
Thank you all again.
Yep.